Okay, good evening everybody. I think we should make a start. Welcome to the Institute of Education, and my name is Tizendra Ferrali, if we haven't met before. And welcome to the seminar on education in conflict and emergencies. So these seminars are running for about 4 years now, and this is the third seminar of this year's series. I know that some of you have attended the previous 2 seminars. I was not able to come and meet with you, but I actually watched both of them live. And this seminar is also live streamed, so we have a network which is called Network for Research in Education, Conflict and Emergencies. So we have a kind of a Facebook group. So if you haven't joined, and if you are on Facebook, which I assume most of us
what about the Twitter?
are, yeah, we can do tweeting as well. So it's live streamed and would be available to watch afterwards. Also, that a lot of other activities that take place, in the area of education, conflict and emergencies, we share those on our Facebook page. Today, I'm very delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Viola Selenica. Viola, we know each other for a few years, and I know her work, and she's been absolutely brilliant in trying to understand education from a multidisciplinary perspectives, particularly from political science, international relations, those sorts of issues. I was lucky enough to read some of her work a couple of years ago. Viola is currently a visiting fellow at University of Sussex, and she did her PhD from the University of Trento in Italy. Her BA was on international relations and political science from the University of Bologna in Italy. Then she went to the University of Amsterdam, and where she did her international development studies. And then afterwards, a postgraduate diploma on peace and conflict from the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. She's worked for International Training Program for Conflict Management, Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy, and also worked for UNESCO as a consultant, and also for Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. So there was a fantastic article on attacks on higher education that Viola authored. So she specializes on political economy and politics of education reforms, state building and state formation in war and post-war settings. And also she works on peace building issues, conflict security and global governance of aid and development. Clearly, Viola has expertise on Kosovo and East Timor. And the plan now is to talk about an hour or so, and then we'll have the rest of the time for comments, questions, and discussions. Okay, so over to you, Viola.
Thank you, Tejendra, for inviting me today and to present some of my research I did during my PhD on a topic which I think is still important, and it is even more important today, namely post-humanitarian and post-liberal world, in which both peace building and state building are somehow questions and put under question mark. So what I will be trying to present today is more or less my research on East Timor and Kosovo, and why at some point I started working on that, and why that was significant, and what was the kind of initial puzzle that pushed me into working on these very complex processes and relationships. And the way I also structure my research, and I would like to structure also the presentation today, is first of all, what I wanted to understand was what kind of models of education were emerging in post-conflict states, states that actually were born out of war and that were heavily shaped by international assistance and intervention. And investigate that complex relationship between conflict, peace building, and state building, and their relationship to education, as well as delving into that multi-layered hybrid governance of education, which is in this context, but not only in Kosovo and East Timor, increasingly shaped and structured through a very conflictual interaction between local and international actors. And also, the way I approach this, this topic, not just by combining a number of perspectives, because that is my background, very multidisciplinary. So I don't come traditionally from the education field. I come from IR and political science, but also development studies. So I use these different analytical frameworks, conflict analysis, all the debate on critical approaches to peace building and state building, the critical culture, political economy of education, trying to understand how education is embedded in broader political and economic structures. And I also, what I thought was interesting to do is not just focusing on one level of education, which was to some extent, which would imply to follow a bit the agenda of international actors, thus focusing primarily on primary education. I considered different levels of education and the extent to which international local actors were focusing on each of them as variations through which different models of education emerge in these settings. So although I choose two very different cases, and I will explain in a while why I choose those cases, I set up a framework to kind of ensure validity to compare these cases, but at the same time, as I say here, let the field speaking. So having a kind of a sensitivity to context and contingency. So once on the ground, trying to understand what were the priorities and what were the tensions and contentious levels of education or areas of reform. So mainly the project was looking at processes of post-conflict education reform and reconstruction embedded in broader international peace building and state building interventions, but not looking at to what extent education contributes to peace building and state building, as those two terms are everything and nothing, and I don't think it would add anything new. Rather, looking at what kind of peace and state is education contributing to build, and it is informing or reflecting, and that at the same time how specific agendas of peace building and state building are shaping specific kinds of education. So looking at this dialectical relationship between these processes. And as I started working on this in 2011, it was right in that moment, just pure coincidence, that UNICEF started working on the same topic, education and peace building. While in the early 90s, we all know that the focus was on education. And in emergencies, due also to a number of what were framed at the time humanitarian crises, then in the early 2000s, as I'll go back also to the end of the presentation, there's a shift in focus towards the two phases of education, how education contributes to a conflict or prevent it. Now, in the early 2000s, UNICEF started working and heavily financing also a lot of research on kind of investigating the more complex and multiple ways through which education interacts with peace building and contributes to peace building. In my case, I mean, my concern was, as I'd done my master thesis on Kosovo, and I knew that Kosovo was the most ambitious peace building mission in the UN history, Kosovo and East Timor. So I was curious to see how a field such as that of education, which was crucial for nation building and state formation historically in the West, in terms of social cohesion, national economy, identity and citizenship building, how it was treated and reformed in this context. Also, given the increasing policy and donor attention to education, so not just in emergencies, but also as a humanitarian and longer-term developmental responses. At that time, knowledge on the role of education in peace building and state building was lacking, and especially there was little emphasis on the role of international actors. What was the international community actually doing in those specific settings of peace building and state building? And through this research, I try to go beyond the two phases of education, as already a number of scholars have argued. Education is linked to peace and processes of state building and national building in much more complex and often conflictual ways. Education is important in terms of either fooling or addressing discrimination, segregation, social division, the reproduction of inequalities, but at the same time, depending on how it is reformed, shaped, and interacts with other broader structures, it can contribute to truth, ethnic reconciliation, transitional justice, and social change. So I argue that the topic is still relevant today, and theoretically it tried to shed light on the transformation of education and the state during international liberal interventionism. Methodologically, it tried to provide with insights on how to navigate the complex and multi-layered governance of education in conflict and post-conflict countries. And I think it advances knowledge on processes of policy making and agenda setting of education reform in conflict and post-conflict settings. So why I choose Kosovo and East Timor? As I said earlier, I think in '99, when the Kosovo War and then later on the East Timor conflict occurred, I think there was the highest peak of international interventionism and of the UN role in conflict zones. Through what was at that time called humanitarian war in Kosovo and later on in East Timor, the UN and the broader international community set the most ambitious agenda in not just intervening in post-conflict reconstruction, but having the ambitious goal to rebuild nations and states from the scratch. And indeed, in both cases, the UN took not just a leading role in terms of administrative, executive, legislative functions, but it became the state itself. It acted as a state in order to build the state. And from some, it was defined even as neo-colonial actor and a neo-colonial approach. And what was striking to me is that Kosovo is in the Western Balkans and East Timor is in Southeast Asia. And these two cases are extremely different in all respects. Nevertheless, in '99, they were treated as the same kind of setting that could be treated in the same way. And indeed, the state building and peace building mission that was set in place in Kosovo in June '99 was repeated exactly, even not just the same legal framework, but also the same officials, UN officials. They were literally transferred from Kosovo to East Timor. So I was curious to see to what extent then their approach even towards education was similar, or whether contextual differences were taken into account. So the way I structured case study analysis, Kosovo and East Timor, I wanted to investigate the relationship between conflict peace building and state building, and also kind of analyze through a kind of a genealogical approach, the role of education before the war, how it was intertwined with also conflict drivers. And also discourses, agendas, and actors shaping post-conflict education during a long period, 15 years, from 1999 to 2014. And more specifically, analyzing the politics of education reform, so looking at analyzing institutionally what was done and by whom, and then delving more into those contentious issues such as curricula and textbooks reforms, and in the case of Kosovo, higher education. So in Kosovo, which was, it was during Yugoslavia the poorest region, with a majority of non-Slavic speaking ethnic group, that is Albanians. Education already between the 70s and 1889 was linked to root causes of the national question. There was a main conflict between Serbs and Albanians, and that made education already an historically problematic foundation for post-war peace building. In 90, sorry, I put it 99, it's 1990, 98, education was even more important because it was one of the main venues through which Kosovo Albanians resisted repression from the Milosevic regime, but in a peaceful way. And education was organized in an underground parallel way against Serbian repression. It was mainly organized in private houses. And especially throughout this decade, immediately before the war, it was ethnically segregated and separated in structure and in content. This was a picture I took of the main high school in Pristina, the capital, this September. It was bombed during the war by the Serbian police, and of course, it has been left like this. Destroyed. Is a private house with 2 floors, and actually it's shocking to see it still like this, but as a testimony and proof of the effects of war on education. So when I went to Kosovo to study state building and peace building, those 2 terms, and as I said earlier, are very difficult to kind of, first of all, analytically distinguish, especially in UN missions. There has been a long debate on whether they are the same thing or one precedes the others. Now, peace building broadly tries to address root causes of the conflict and, to some extent, seeks to transform them, while state building has a kind of a more narrow focus on strengthening state institutions, formal institutions, and state capacities. Now, I assume education could be an important venue through which peace building and state building purposes could be achieved. As I said earlier, the UN peace building mission in Kosovo was kind of a state within a state or above and beyond the state. And indeed, in the Kosovo case, the UN approach to rebuilding education was identified as more or less an experiment in the making. And the approach, both, as we will see later in the East Timorese case, is very similar. They treated Kosovo as an empty kind of shell, a tabula rasa, where everything was destroyed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. So national and communist and institutional legacies were kind of ignored. They thought that they were meant to be destroyed by the war. What had and what defined education, especially from the side of international actors, was a kind of a multiculturalism framework, which was informed by the same peace-building framework. And this led, in the long term, to decentralized and ethnically based education for the sake of stability, and at the same time competing in exclusivist national narratives which reflected and reproduced the conflict. And that is quite paradoxical, because the UN in Kosovo tried to build a multicultural state, but at the same time, the way it tried to do that, through this decentralized and ethnically based, not just education, the state itself, it fooled and it perpetuated ethnicity as a category rather than multiculturalism. Now in Kosovo, one of the main problems at the time, and it's still today, is it has been the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, and the fact that Kosovo is, for 100 states, a recognized independent state, but for 100 others is still part of Serbia. And one of the, I think, the pitfalls of the international liberal agenda in Kosovo was identifying ethnicity as causes of conflict and overlooking other equally important dimensions, such as the development issue. So there was a narrow understanding of multiculturalism based on ethnic identity, which led to a system of decentralized municipalities. As I said earlier, the UN in Kosovo disregarded institutional legacy, and this would have long-term effects, also in terms of how much local capacities and local ownership was taken into account and actually being incorporated and being part of the process. And for the sake of stability, not just in education, but more broadly in other sectors, it favored certain political Kosovo Albanian elites over others. When it comes to the politics of curriculum reform, the first 2 years especially, the process was externally driven by UNICEF, very chaotic. There was the adoption, the first act was the adoption of the new curriculum framework, and its main objectives were to build a pluralist, inclusive, and multicultural society through education. And a number of European standards and a learner-centered approach was used to inform education reforms, but very often, also through interviews that I conducted on the ground, teachers were excluded from the process, and very often, rather than adopting it, they were trying either to resist or adapt to the national curriculum framework. The tensions were even more visible in the politics of textbooks reforms, because in the post-war phase, as in other post-war contexts, in the aftermath of the war, there was a multiplication of textbooks. And indeed, this led later on to a multiplication also of exclusivist readings of history. History has been a central key factor in kind of shaping and reproducing the ethnic conflict between Kosovo Serbs and Albanians. At the same time, in the long run, there was a lack of willingness by the Albanian governments to integrate Serbian population into its education system. And the thing was kind of dialectical, because also the minority, the Serbian minority, was not really interested to be integrated. And paradoxically, they now were running their parallel education system. Now, I think the sector where all these different tensions played out the most was the higher education sector, which was already important before the war, because protests and against the Serbian regime started at the University of Pristina. So to some extent, those legacies still persisted also after the war. And there were many different actors and many different agendas and struggles shaping higher education in Kosovo since '99. And what was interesting here to see is that each of these actors, Serbians, or the Serbian state, Kosovo Albanians or the international community were not homogeneous. They were extremely heterogeneous within their groups. So there were different struggles between Albanian and political academic elites, the Albanian political elites and international community, within the academic elites itself and the international community, and so on and so forth. The kind of higher education that was to be rebuilt after the war, and to what extent it could be inclusive or exclusive vis-à-vis the minorities. And indeed, this sector has been the level of education where ethnic separation has been reflected and perpetuated and played out the most. Now, the attempt by UNMIK, which was the UN mission in Kosovo in the beginning, was truly to build a multi-ethnic university. Based on the interviews I've conducted with some of former UNMIK officials, but also Kosovo Albanians education activists and teachers, they tried at the beginning to put different ethnic communities together, but this attempt soon failed, and I would say they didn't insist it for a long time. So for the sake, again, of stability, they accepted this separation, which was fueled by local actors. At the same time, I argue they also contributed to this separation because there was a certain asymmetry in donor funding and attention, of course, supporting more Kosovo Albanians than Serbs. So in the end, 15 years later, when I went to Pristina, the de facto situation on the ground was that of the creation of parallel ethnically segregated universities, carrying and fighting for the same name. On the one side, the University of Pristina in the capital, and the University of Pristina in Kosovska Mitrovica, which is a northern city inhabited by mainly Serbs in the north of Kosovo. In terms of discourses and narratives that have informed higher education in Kosovo, I think the Bologna process and the knowledge-based society were two main hegemonic narratives. There was an attempt to Europeanize higher education at a very early stage, and this was made in a decontextualized way, with most of the actors, especially local professors and academics, not even being aware what were these European or Western standards that they were expected to implement in the higher education sectors. And then at, around a few years later, when Kosovo political elite declared independence, so they kind of took control even more strongly on the education sector and higher education, they completely liberalized the sector. So there was a proliferation of public and private institutions, which led to a devaluation of quality and knowledge, and which was very often made not just for issues related to education, but to address probably unemployment in a quite a problematic way. So what has shaped post-war education in Kosovo in the aftermath of war has been intra-Albanian relations, the politics of Serb-Albanian relations, and international intervention, which have made the challenge and the goal to transform conflict through education a very complex task. The politics of education reform was strategically shaped between Kosovo, Serbian, and international actors, not always in kind of predictable way, I would say more in a chaotic way. And the dominant international view informing education reform in post-war Kosovo has been that of a post-communist country with an ethno-national problem, overlooking other dimensions such as that of development or employment. So without risking to simplify it too much, one would say that after 15 years of commitment from international actors in Kosovo, Kosovo is a weak state, and if we can talk of peace in Kosovo, I would more dare to say it's a frozen conflict, but one could also say it's kind of negative or segregated peace, which has led to segregated education. Now, throughout the 90s and following the Yugoslavian wars, the focus shifted from class to national identity. In post-war Kosovo, the international community tried to kind of shift the focus from national identity and ethnically based identity to multi-ethnic identity. But the education in Kosovo remained marginal by both to the UN peacebuilding and state-building agenda. So this was one of the things I wanted also to investigate on the ground, because I went there when there was quite a lot of noise from different international actors, especially UNICEF, on the role of peacebuilding, etc., and the role of education in peacebuilding. And I wanted to see and to check also empirically to what extent there was a feedback on the ground and vice versa. Now, the East Timor case, I tried to analyze it similarly to the Kosovo case, looking at the roles and functions of post-war education in building peace and focusing on the politics of post-war education reform. But then I zoomed on three conflictual issues in the case of post-war education reform in East Timor, which were the multilingual foundations of the nation and how this was addressed or failed to be addressed in education reform, the question of religion and Catholicism and history curriculum. If one looks at the history of East Timor, even more than in the case of Kosovo, identity and education have been shaped for centuries by international actors, not just the post-99 period, but already in 1513, when it became a Portuguese colony until 1975, Portugal favored a certain kind of education, very much focused on building a small administrative elite. So one would say really elite focusing and driven. During Indonesia invaded East Timor just a few months after it became independent from Portugal, so 74 until 99, and it completely changed the approach towards education because it promoted mass education as a means for ideological and especially linguistic indoctrination. And during those 25 years, education became central to the conflict as a site of ethno-linguistic contestation and also a key struggle for the liberation, for the struggle for liberation. And immediately before the referendum, which led then to the short civil war, education was identified by the Timorese leaders in exile as crucial to the building of a decolonial, post-colonial identity, as crucial for the transformation and the building of the nation. So the post-99 agenda of state building, very similarly as in Kosovo, it followed a similar process, although the creation of the state came much earlier in 2002. But the UN mission was extremely similar, if not identical, to the Kosovo mission. Now, I argue that in the case of Kosovo, the international community misread the conflict and made probably an analysis of the conflict and conflict causes very much focusing on ethnicity, while in the case of East Timor, there was a complete lack of analysis of the conflict. I mean, the assumption was that as the main focus of conflict, the Indonesian occupation, was removed, then there was no need for building peace because the society was already united. So the focus was on state building and short-term reconstruction. And the mission itself was built in such a way that it was being renewed every 2 years. So not really allowing for space for long-term developmental assistance towards education. So peace was identified as an outcome of Indonesian withdrawal, and there was less attention to longer-term development and peace-building objectives. This would change after 2006, the first of a number of political crises that would follow afterwards. So when it comes to analyzing the relationship between education, conflict, and peace, one of the questions I was trying to address also through my fieldwork and interviews was, among whom is peace to be built? In the initial phase, many divisions were completely ignored. The society was deemed as extremely cohesive and united. So political divisions running through the East-West and among different ethno-linguistic groups or political elites were overlooked. There were a number of further potential conflict triggers, such as youth, social, economic, and gender inequalities that, again, were largely overlooked. So one of the things I was trying to understand in the East Timor case was to what extent education was underpinned by social justice objectives, using also Nancy framework, social justice framework, to what extent the curriculum, for example, that was built was relevant, adaptable, equally accessible to all children, and whether and how education contributed to nation building, social cohesion, and state legitimacy. So after full independence in 2002, at least on paper, education was expected to play a leading role in the transformation of the Timorese society. So social cohesion, political legitimacy, and economic development were tied to education. And education was identified as providing citizens with knowledge and skills that were necessary for development. However, especially in the first 3 years, but I would say actually in the first 15 years, the focus was and has always been on infrastructure reconstruction. In the beginning, one of the main priorities was not just bringing kids back to school, but also recruiting teachers on a voluntary basis, because most of the teachers, especially at the secondary level, were Timorese. So not only schools, as in the case of Kosovo, were destroyed for almost 80%, but the teacher workforce completely disappeared. So one of the early strategies was the reintroduction of Portuguese and Tetum and the exclusion of Bahasa, which was identified as a language of the occupier. However, this was done in a very kind of hasty way, without deeper analysis of the fact that Portuguese was always the language of the elite, and only 6% of the population spoke Portuguese. And Tetum, which was like a lingua franca used during the resistance, was not spoken by everyone. So there were other 12 different languages that in the initial phase were completely ignored. Then towards 2002, 2005, there was a shift from reconstruction to quality reforming, focusing on pedagogy and content. And as in the case of Kosovo, in the first phase, UNICEF was running the process of curriculum reform, and then it was kind of handed over to the locals. Now, especially when I was there in 2013, which was 1 year after the official ending of the UN mission, what I realized also with interviews with international officials from the World Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO, AusAid, Australian Aid, New Zealand Aid. The international community was lacking vision and coordination. The donor engagement remained high and very much focused on capacity building and capacity development. And what was kind of shocking and striking for me was that after 15 years of international assistance, there was still a huge army of international experts and consultants, making the whole education system and administration and the Ministry of Education heavily relying on education, on international experts. They couldn't run reform without. So there was this vicious circle of trying to rebuild capacities, but actually full dependence on international assistance and community. So one of the challenges in education, some of the challenges in education 15 years after international commitment to building education was 70%, for example, of grade 1 students failed to read a word in the main official language. And it took, on average, 11.2 years to complete 6 years of primary education. Most of the teachers were still poorly qualified, and there were still huge disparities in access in terms of rural and urban and gender. So in the focus of education reform, I would say, has been for the first 15 years on reconstruction and access. And then as the local government was taking more ownership on education reform, they started kind of not following anymore kind of international priorities or global policies agendas focusing on primary education, but they were focusing more on preschool education, vocational training, and mother tongue. So this was quite interesting because it happened immediately after the UN mission was closed. However, and at the same time, until 2012, there was no focus on how to address questions of education and unemployment and demography in such a young country. Both Kosovo and East Timor are extremely young countries. However, as in the case of Kosovo, even in East Timor, education was increasingly less of a priority for the national government. Languages created a lot of tensions in the reform of education in East Timor. As I said earlier, the exclusion of Baja was made very quickly, and at the same time, very quickly was reintroduced Portuguese. And this created lots of literacy problems, and also to teachers who were supposed to teach in Portuguese, but they didn't speak a word in Portuguese. So in the end, the choice of languages has been very divisive, and probably a more context-sensitive and pragmatic approach would have been more suitable. Now, the same choice was made for religion. Again, the way religion was excluded from the curriculum was very much elite-driven. The idea was to build a secular state, but East Timorese identity has been strongly tied to Catholicism. So it was initially excluded from the curriculum, but following protests from the church and civil society, now it is reinstated at the school discretion. Another question that has created a lot of tension has been the multiplication of religious schools, not just Catholic schools, that have full tensions with Catholic schools. As in the case of Kosovo, also here, history was somehow considered to be too much of a controversial subject, so it was relegated as part of a broader subject which was called Studio do Meio, which was like civic education. Now, there has been an attempt in the last years to introduce it as a specific subject. However, what has been the restructuring of history curricula has suffered from the fact that a complex and endogenous history was not put in the history curricula. Now, the governance of education, I call it hybrid, but I think it's probably the best term would be multi-layered governance of education. Officially, international actors were not involved after 2002 when East Timor became independent. However, their role has been important until at least 2012. And many have focused on capacity and system building, although they have suffered a lack of coordination. As I said earlier, in the absence of a clear vision of education, disproportion of international advisors perpetuate independency. So similar to Kosovo, the dominant international view informing post-99 education reform in East Timor has been that of the same empty shell and tabula rasa approach. So everything was to be rewritten from scratch. And interestingly, in the case of East Timor, even more than in the case of Kosovo, local actors were very willing, optimistic, euphoric on the role of education in building the new nation. But their agency was ignored in those first 2 years, which I think are extremely important in the kind of course and education reforms take long term. So there were high expectations, especially from local actors, on the transformative and national building role of education. Yet, education was, similar to Kosovo, very marginal to peace building and state building agendas. Education was expected to build human and social capital. It was linked, especially in interviews, to peace building, yet in not a clear way. The choice of language, especially Portuguese, has polarized society. And the multiplicity of actors and interventions has made education a site of contestation between different agendas. But the fact that the local government is focusing more on mother tongue, preschool education, vocational training, not really focusing international donors, and there is a greater attention to the teaching of history. I think it's quite promising, although education remains very marginal to governmental agendas. So in this, which I call externally driven education systems, priorities are set by a plethora of local international actors, often lacking coordination. In both cases, main focus has been on reconstruction and increasing access at primary level. And the opportunity for system transformation, especially in the immediate post-conflict moment, was missed. In Kosovo, all sectors have been prioritized, but increasingly higher education and vocational training, and especially community education, education for minorities. Now, in comparing and contrasting these two case studies, I saw that in the case of Kosovo, only education strategies aim at providing a unified, inclusive, multicultural education, transformed along modern European standards. While the vision has increased education in Kosovo is far from unified curriculum provided. In East Timor, there is still a discussed shift of access to quality, although this again reflects given the recent national struggle. However, a similar tabula rasa approach from the international community and different conflict sensitivities, or their lack of, has kept education very marginal to both processes. And more broadly, structural fragilities and conflict drivers have not been addressed. In both cases, I would say there has been a promotion of a limited form of state, very similar to other peace-building missions, liberal democracy, underpinned by liberalization and institution building. And the reform of education has been embedded within an incomplete process of nation building, with education reinforcing this problematic. Education thus has not been a strategic sector in the peace-building agenda in both contexts, and the type of peace that has been built, it's more kind of one is familiar with the debate on critical peace building. It's kind of a hybrid peace, very conservative, orthodox, closer to stability than development of social justice. In Kosovo, inter-ethnic divisions were tackled through a very narrow understanding of form of multiculturalism, and education in Kosovo responding to security and stability imperatives. With this I mean that the fact that education was being resegregated again, but in opposite direction, the international community didn't do a lot, if not nothing, to address this, because that would have meant kind of touching broader political agendas of the local actors. And in both cases, security and stability was much more important than a positive peace that addresses conflict causes. And indeed, preceding what now has become dominant in human approaches to conflict management, or one would even say probably it has always been about this, an agenda of stabilization rather than building a sustainable peace. So education in this context is shaped by actors operating in, through, and beyond the nation state, and I don't think this is something that could be linked to the post-conflict phase, I would say, at least in the case of Kosovo or Timor, but I think you could also name many other cases. This is a permanent condition. The preeminence of local response, which was not formal in the beginning, was ignored and excluded from the process. There has been a lot of focus on local agency and ownership, but at the same time how international actors have interacted with local actors. They indeed have sidelined local capacities. In the case of East Timor, there has been a higher permeability or power of international actors, as probably the country is much more fragile than the Kosovo. And also there has been a disconnection between policy making on the ground and the rearticulation of agendas and discourse at the global level. So if at the global level, at that specific moment in which I was doing my field work, there was a lot of emphasis on peace building, I didn't hear even the echo of that on the ground. No one was focusing on peace building in education. So going back to one of my research questions, what kind of models of educations emerge in these post-war new states? An education which is globalized and hybrid, I'd call, between limited form of statehood and a kind of a peace and stability, and which is shaped by a combination of global education policies and local agendas. Interventions have increased dependency on international assistance in both cases, hampering those local capacities that the intervention claims to be building. As in other sectors, stability has determined educational choices and priorities. So, and this was also one of the pessimistic conclusions of my thesis, also when I defended my thesis. Despite the great potential of education, in both cases it has neither addressed nor transformed root conflict causes, and it has not contributed to social cohesion, justice, and change. Perhaps, but not only, because education has been extremely marginal in peace-building and state-building agendas in Kosovo and East Timor. And it has reflected, legitimized, and enhanced those prevailing models of peace-building and state-building, to some extent incorporating and to some extent reproducing their pitfalls and shortcomings. So I wanted to close with this slide because I defended my PhD thesis 2 years ago, and since then I've been to Kosovo several times. I'm from Albania, so I speak the local language. And now where I'm moving, and I'm actually doing research in Kosovo again, is investigating this link between education, counter-radicalization, and CV. As I said at the beginning, if the focus in the 90s was on education emergencies, then it moved towards investigating the relationship of education with conflict, although in a very simplistic and binary way. Then later on, for a very short period, UNICEF was focusing on education and peace building, the multiple ways through which education contributes to peace. And then, of course, in the late 2010s, also following the global war on terror, the Arab Springs, now again, education focuses in emergencies, but in, I would say, post-humanitarian, post-liberal global order. Because for all the pitfalls of humanitarianism and the extent to which it has been criticized for promoting certain Western liberal political agendas, now I think the focus is in a global order, and in this historical moment in which it is extremely difficult to actually provide education in a number of humanitarian emergencies such as Yemen or Syria. But what is more interesting is that now, increasingly, both in the West, in the core and the peripheries, education functions and roles are prioritized, but I would say in a very conservative way, by looking at how education can prevent terrorism, radicalization, and violent extremism. Well, UK is the most famous case in this regard, but the interesting thing is that the model of the UK model of using education and incorporating education to prevent strategy is something that is being now, through the European Union, exported also in this context, in the case of Kosovo. In the current Kosovo national strategy on countering terrorism and violent extremism, 45% of the activities are assigned to the Ministry of Education, so making education a central sector and actor in fighting these challenges, these threats. So I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Viola. I think it was really interesting. What you really presented here is, some of the common issues that we see in most of the countries affected by violent conflict, there seems to be identity as one of the main issues. Obviously, language becomes another issue, and also after the conflict, whenever there are reform programs in education, curriculum, teaching of history, they become quite problematic. But also, I think what you highlighted is that are we expecting too much of education in terms of supporting the bigger issues of peace building and state building? Clearly, through reforms in education, in order to see those changes, it's going to take time. But the UN type of architecture doesn't have that extended patience in order to enable that sustainable change. So you clearly see stabilization, as you pointed out at the end, as the major goal of the peace building approach, and then quickly introducing sort of market-based policies where the economy is kind of presented as a problem-solving mechanism. Yeah. But I was also wondering at the same time, the way that you drew conclusions from your study, is it possibly because that you were looking at it from the UN peacebuilding approach, which has got obviously very little attention to education as such, because education really didn't feature until very recently in the UN peacebuilding structure. So because you're approaching the change in education from UN perspective, do you think that led to draw a conclusion that education was not recognized or was not being seen as a potential sort of driver for peace?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, my focus was, my main focus was on not adopting, rather starting from that external perspective. Although because a lot had been done already on the role of education, looking from the more domestic internal perspective. So I wanted to kind of reverse the perspective and looking, and of course, I used very much the UN commitment. It was like, I would say that that variable that made me choose those two case studies. So absolutely, that might have affected also some of my conclusions. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, and I think we've got plenty of time for questions and comments. So, yeah.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for a really comprehensive and nuanced presentation of the two cases of Kosovo and East Timor, and particularly with reference to the role that international actors play in terms of sometimes perpetuating divisive elements of conflict. I think that's often neglected, and a lot of the wider context is glossed over, and perhaps that's part of the problem, as you concluded in the end. So you mentioned education and counterterrorism and counter-radicalization, and that was the area of my question. In terms of prevention and in terms of local agency and involving local actors, what are your views on critical peace education in terms of its use of narratives of what may be considered, or in terms of its use of what may be considered radical narratives in themselves, such as resistance and violence towards peace building, or making shifts towards peace building in a contextualized way? And I'm thinking in particular about the case of Lebanon, and I know Tijendra is very involved in that context, but I also wrote myself on the absence of the civil war from the from official history education in Lebanon, and how that poses very similar dilemmas to the ones you described, although the context regionally and in terms of the UN involvement is different. But there are lots of similarities, and again, my question is, what's your view on the use of what may be considered radicalized narratives as tools to make shifts for peace building, but in a contextualized and relevant way that employs what's happening on the ground, as opposed to abstractions that are being funneled down top to bottom?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Lebanon case, and I was in Kosovo in September, so I've just started on this topic. I think that not just in Kosovo, but also increasingly in the Caucasus as well, there is kind of also as part of the stabilization agenda. It's like now the focus is not anymore on peace building, but on countering violent extremism and radicalization. I mean, we're still talking about the same thing, containing threatening peripheries, and managing risk deriving from radicalization and violent extremism. So in the case of Kosovo, I see that the focus has been shifting from peace building to counter-radicalization and counter-terrorism. But already, I think in 2014, Mandy Turner was talking about peace building as counter-insurgency in the Palestinian case. So what is, I think, dangerous and might have some side effects with regard to education, for example, in the Kosovo case, is that the same use of concepts and the meanings of radicalization and violent extremism, I think, are part of the problem. Because when I was trying to understand what was the meaning of radicalization of violent extremism in the case of Kosovo, different local actors, also from the education sector, they were saying everything that produces violence or everything that is outside social norms, as if social norms were something natural, not something constructed. So in the case of education or building counter-narratives, the risk is that there's a kind of a conservative and very securitized way of framing the radical and who is the radical, and also framing as potentially dangerous also radical objectives for social change and for social emancipation. So I think the dangerous thing of co-opting education as part of this security agendas, both fueled by international and local actors, is that, especially when it comes to education and youth, because these are two main sectors in Lebanon, in Kosovo, in North Africa, Middle East, they are being framed as either potentially dangerous subjects to be de-radicalized, or as frontliners to prevent and to act as security actors to fight terrorism and radicalization. So,
can I ask you a question there?
Yeah.
Because even in Tajikistan, the shift has taken place towards talking about counter-terrorism, but who are the actors funding this discourse? So if you look at who are the key trading partners, where is the funding coming from? So you have China, you have Uyghur Xinjiang region which borders Tajikistan, you look at Russia, you look at US funding. The funding is coming from here, and these are the biggest trading influences. So, and then the ruling party uses the aid coming from there to strengthen its own position and actually kill the legitimate activists as terrorists. Yes, so I just wonder, who are the key trading blocks involved here?
In the case of Kosovo,
Yeah, and where is the military? So whose military is peacekeeping military here, and who is giving aid to fund this agenda?
Yeah, in the case of Kosovo, I was expecting the EU to play a leading role, also because Kosovo is part of the enlargement agenda, but actually the US is the main actor in the case of Kosovo, investing a huge amount of money on youth and countering violent extremism, and on different types of trainings and education to raise awareness among local communities, civil society, women, children. I mean, also here you see them, at least in Kosovo, this very chaotic governance of different international local actors, also civil society actors, journalists, going into schools from primary level to university and teaching kids the effects of becoming radical. So the fact that how to spot the radical and how to report it to the police, thus expecting from families, religious leaders, social workers, teachers, to kind of act as security actors and to surveil and to report and to denounce, and actually
it's very much prevent model.
Yeah, hampering those kinds of relations that are based on trust, such as education and social work. So yeah, it's very much informed by the prevent model, but I think the prevent model has been taken by all over Europe and now exported to non-European countries. So it's been the hegemonic model since 2005.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
You made brief mention of what was going on in Kosovo before UNMIK kind of came in. There was a brief mention that education was mainly organised in houses, was that right?
Yeah.
So, and then, of course, UNMIK kind of disregarded this. Do you know anything about what people in Kosovo taught their children prior to the international community stepping in?
In terms of history or in general?
In general?
Yeah, they were using different kinds of textbooks, mainly coming from Albania. But this was also during Yugoslavia. There was a shortage of Albanian speaking textbooks. So they were mainly taken by Albania or the Republic of Macedonia. I have a lot of friends and activists that started during those years, and they recognized the huge absence of quality in that kind of education. Although it was a kind of, maybe one of the interesting things of that kind of education was that it was very informal, bottom-up. All the society was involved into making it run because it represented one of the main pillars of showing that Kosovo could be a state, could act as a state through this bottom-up education. I think in terms of history curricula, it was extremely divisive. Also because I grew up in Albania, so I remember the story we were told, and very nationalist, very exclusivist, very against Serbs and the rest of the Slavic-speaking countries in the Balkans. I'm Albanian-speaking, so it's not Slavic. So before the international community stepping in, I mean, it was a very nationalistic kind of history that was being told in schools, not critical at all. It was based on, building and constructing the enemy and the other, and framing it as Serbs or.
So repetitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's the same scenario everywhere you go to, right?
Yeah.
Because teaching of history is about strengthening national pride and glory, and unless you create the other as the risk or the danger for the national integrity and sovereignty or security, then it doesn't function. So that's the whole thing. I don't think it's just the case of Kosovo. I think you can find those scenarios everywhere else, including in this country, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they did, in fairness to my history teacher, they did teach us what historiography was, and she was actually really cool. She was like, what do you think this particular this particular textbook
Yeah.
tells us about Portugal and might there be a voice from the other side. I think that in modern history teaching, I realise is an inexcusably general term, but I think that there is, at least in some places, a bent towards having students think more critically about history.
Mm-hmm.
But so I wouldn't say quite everywhere, but yeah,
It's the degree, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's so much about teachers' agency as well. So who the individual teacher is matters a lot.
So basically that relates to your comment earlier about critical peace education, which critical history education could be part of. That it's not just looking at national pride from one perspective, but also trying to look at it from other perspectives. But it's a very, I guess, radical way of teaching history, which could be challenging in the sense that it destabilizes the hegemonic control of the authority, as you were talking about, because it's also about questioning the power and the distribution of resources and who's been privileged and who's been marginalized. So doing that critical analysis can rupture the control that has maintained stability. So it's a very difficult thing to do, including in the case of Lebanon. Okay, so maybe we should take other questions. Laura there.
So we talked about the attempt at having multi-ethnicity as part of the education actually reinforcing ethnic pride. And I wondered how that happened and how you think it would need to be approached differently.
Yeah, in the case of Kosovo, as ethnicity was identified as the main cause of conflict. In the beginning, UNMIK tried to organize schools through shifts, trying to keep Serbs, the main groups that were fighting each other were Serbs and Albanians, trying to keep them under the same roof. A bit similar to the Bosnian case, under the same roof but running parallel, one after the other. Now, this was boycotted by both local actors, so there was no interest in embracing and adopting that multi-ethnic approach to education. So what UNMIK did, not just in education, more broadly, in how it conceived the state in Kosovo, was giving more autonomy to different ethnic groups. So the Albanians are 90% of the population, and you have Serbs, Roma, Ashkali, Egyptian, Bosnians, Turks, several of them. And in the Kosovo constitution, they have the same rights, although one is 90% of the population and others are 2 or 3%. Now, this created more divisions than interaction between these groups, because by giving them full autonomy on methods also of education, what was created were these decentralized municipalities, very homogeneous within each other. I mean, UNMIK and the international community imagined that there was no interaction between these communities before the war, but actually the war essentialized identities. So indeed there was interaction between different ethnic groups. So by giving each group a very huge autonomy, UNMIK kind of pulled homogenization, ethnic homogenization within the group, and polarization between different groups. So Serbs and other ethnic minorities even exploited this kind of independence they have, and they thought that it was much more advantageous to their political agendas to not interact with the Kosovo Albanian state. So they kept those powers, they ran their own education, and I think one of the mistakes of UNMIC, which had also implications in education, was this emphasis on decentralization, which was based and made along ethnic terms. So I think this was one of the big mistakes. So I wouldn't have, to some extent, it expected from Kosovo Albanians, which were already very nationalistic. And I think it's pulled even more than nationalism by trying to denationalize them. It expected from Kosovo Albanians something that Western societies did completely differently in their own societies. Because, I mean, the French model, but not just the French model, is based on assimilation. Other models are based more on integration, right? And interculturalism. So why would you expect Kosovars, I mean, to have the same powers and the same autonomies as small ethnic minorities? So by giving too much power to these ethnic minorities, it actually fueled ethnic divisions. I mean, it's really kind of sounds almost paradoxical, but unfortunately the result has been this ethnic segregation of education.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask you a little bit more about East Timor.
Yeah.
You said very interestingly that the international community did not do any analysis before entering East Timor. Could you explain why that happened? It was a matter of time. And in which way do you think that the international community should have done such an analysis? And finally, on the issue of language, because in East Timor is widely divided, you said briefly that, if I'm not mistaken, that mother tongue was more locally developed and locally supported. I understand mother tongue is also very divisive within East Timor also. And I would like to know from your research what would be, when you talk about a more pragmatic approach, could you clarify a little bit more what you mean by that? Thank you so much.
Yeah, very good question, thank you. When I approached both case studies, and I wanted to see to what extent the international community was sensitive to context and to history, or the extent to which it was oblivious to both. As I said in the presentation, I think there was a misreading of in both cases of the conflict, but even more in the case of East Timor, because it considered only those 25 years of occupation, and when Indonesia withdrew, as I said, the international community thought that the East Timorese were very united because of the national struggle. But interestingly enough, immediately before Indonesia invaded the country, there was just a matter of a few months there was a civil war, brief civil war, which left 1,000 or more of dead people. And already there were a lot of divisions that somehow were overlooked, even within East Timorese leaders. The Frepili movement, etc. But that left really deep scars that were not addressed throughout those 25 years, and to some extent they emerged after, as it is the case in also in other post-conflict settings. Once the war is over, then different elites and divisions emerge in the fight for power, who's going to gain and control resources. So I think it considered the main cause of conflict removed, so East Timor was not considered to be a place that was divided by war, contrary to Kosovo. Indeed, this was one of the different approaches of one of the different things that the international community did in these two countries. Although it approached them similarly in terms of conflict, it considered Kosovo society as highly divided, especially between these two groups. So it developed early warning systems from the UNDP that was monitoring a number of indicators to kind of check conflict and the extent to which there was a risk for conflict relapse. And indeed, in Kosovo, it came early. In 2004, there were the first riots between Kosovo Albanese and Serbs, which were kind of reflecting and expressing more frustration towards the international community and the limbo that was created, the political limbo. Now, in the case of East Timor, it started developing the same mechanisms in 2007, after the first political crisis. So I think one of the things that could have done better, in both cases, but especially in the East Timor's case, is doing a conflict analysis that could have helped also the international administration, how it was shaped, and the priorities it took. Now, in terms of mother tongue, I think the choices of language was, again, driven by this elite that used to study in Lusophone countries, in Mozambique and Portugal. So it was a big mistake to completely remove Bahasa Indonesian, as paradoxically, or not as paradoxically, as in other colonized settings, that was the main language that everyone spoke, even more than Tetum. Now, Tetum was spoken by people in the capital, but then in other cities you had other 12 languages, which could be, again, divisible. What they are trying to do now is not starting with Portuguese as early as primary school, but introducing Portuguese around, I think, secondary education. So starting at kindergarten with mother tongue and gradually moving to Tetum, which is anyway a language which should be the main language of the country. But then, again, this was also one of the mistakes of the international community and the local governments. Tetum was the main language, but they invested much more in Portuguese than in Tetum. So this created a lot of problems also pragmatically in how language were then introduced in the classrooms and implemented. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, reflections? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so I think it's been really interesting, Viola. Thank you so much for such an engaging presentation. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time.
See you next time. The slides.